pastors often feel like it's absolutely true that they give and give and give and feel often where they come up kind of empty on the backside of that. Part of pastoring is loving and leading people to health, right? Spiritual, emotional health, some of those things. And so I just want to, hopefully I can help guard and guide in some ways that help you guys just stay healthy. Because if our pastors are not healthy, if their marriages aren't healthy, if they're not leading in healthy ways, then we're going to fail as a church. And not in the sense that we're failing, quote unquote, people, but we're failing you as pastors, because we should be loving and serving you as much as we love and serve everybody else.
Welcome to Let's Talk About That, the podcast where we dive into conversations about life and share stories of faith. We're thrilled to be on this journey with you. Whether you're a longtime listener, someone who calls the Orchard home, or you're just stopping by, Let's Talk About That is your space to explore, reflect, and connect. Join us as we navigate the intricacies of faith, spiritual formation, and daily life as we invite guests to share their stories with us. So grab a cup of coffee, find a comfortable space, and let's do this together. This is Let's Talk About That, where you can be encouraged and inspired by God's work in our lives.
All right, welcome back. We are here. Let's talk about that. Episode 77. We are rapidly approaching 100, which, wow, couldn't believe that was going to last.
Are we doing a gift card?
You know, we probably should. We did it at 50, so we should do it at 100.
$100 gift card.
That would be wild. I think we should do it. Now, granted, I say rapidly approaching. I mean, it's going to be the end of the year. But, you know, once a week, how it works, it's great. We are entering summer mode. We have had some great conversations the last couple of weeks with some moms talking about what it's like to be a mom and how technology has influenced that. Matt, I thought you and Corey and Trey had a great conversation about, yes, coaching, but more importantly, how to use your influence for the sake of the gospel and gospel conversations.
Yeah, I mean, I told somebody the other day, they were really the stars of that because that was their stories. You know, it was Trey is the FCA guy, and then Corey as a volunteer who just shows up. So
yeah. And
shout out to those guys for using their influence.
What is interesting that I heard just from knowing context in between the lines is in a lot of ways that volunteer position has more influence because Trey's influence came in his position not as the FCA director. Now he has influence on guys like Corey. He can help get plugged in. But now that he's in that, quote, official ministry position, he doesn't have quite that same influence on the kids, which you and I know as pastor is that's why the people are the most powerful tool that the church has.
Yeah. I mean, with a title comes an expectation, right? And when you're a volunteer or you're in quote unquote informal missionary, then a lot of times you don't have a title, at least not a ministry title. It's, I'm FHP officer Corey, I'm nurse so-and-so, I'm teacher so-and-so. And then when you exercise your influence, I think, you know, it has the ability to go places sometimes that, well, you're just doing that because you're a pastor.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, we joke as pastors, sometimes there's just like, it's not a win-win, it's a lose-meh. You know, like if you don't do something for someone in that way, well, you're a pastor, you're supposed to. And if you do, it's just kind of like, meh, you were a pastor, you were supposed to. Yeah. So anyway, I thought it was a really good conversation. You know, the last part about being competitive, number one, Trey did get fired up. Number two, great conversations from Hunter Abercrombie in the group text afterwards. Number three, one of my favorite comments that someone said about me after only having met me at the baseball field and seen me coach is, wow, I didn't know he was a pastor. And they meant that because I get competitive. I get fired up. And one of the tournament directors that has known me as coach just off the field actually saw me coach a few tournaments ago. And they were like, I never would have expected that he would get that fired up. And it was like you said, if you're in sports, it's because you hate to lose, right? And so the competitive nature's there. What is awesome is that in my life, God has transferred that hating to lose passion to being a pastor, actually. And so if you guys see me get fired up on a baseball field, see me in a staff meeting, wouldn't we? Because, I mean, like, we're in a battle. We're in a push here in the kingdom where we're trying to impact lostness, and we want to be just as passionate about that. So I'm thankful to have guys on the team who are. Speaking of guys on the team, we have the privilege, nay, the honor of having our executive pastor, the Right Reverend Michael Federico.
Podcast debut. Michael Federico, ladies and gentlemen. We are beyond privileged and thrilled to have Michael here with us. That was the longest standing ovation anybody's
We're
got
just going to let it go, you know. So, Michael, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very much, Chip.
How much have you been looking forward to this podcast debut?
0.
Look, I think the only reason that Michael got behind the microphone is not because we asked him, because we've asked him several times, and the answer has been...
Yeah, no.
But I think this time it was, okay, Michael, you don't have a choice. You got to sit down and talk with us because today the conversation is going to be revolving around generosity. And we'll get there in a minute. But before we do, because this is your podcast debut, we want to get to know Michael a little bit. And I know the flavor question. And I decided, because in this season of the podcast, I get to be the host. We're moving away from the flavor question. Everybody's been asked the flavor question, who's been on the podcast, but I want to start mixing it up a little bit. We did it with the moms a little bit about TV.
It's because you thought the answer was going to be black licorice, isn't it?
Oh my gosh, Michael. He's coming off the top rope right now.
I'm just kidding. We talked about this on the behind the scenes, and Michael said he would be a T-bone steak. Which
100%.
I'm like, I'm here for it.
Fits.
Yeah.
Ironically, not the first steak answer we've ever had on the podcast. But we've asked a few different questions. Ashton and Mary Beth were coffee. What kind of coffee would you be? The moms were, what TV mom are you most like? All right, so here's the question, Michael. We got it for you. This one is probably one only you could answer. Michael, if you were a classical composer, which classical composer would you be?
Probably Handel.
Handel.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Because at the Orchard we say we like to put a handle on things to make them relevant, or?
No, Handel was a master of reusing his own stuff and even borrowing other stuff. And I don't feel like there's a whole lot of fresh, new things out there, ideas. I think the best ideas are stolen and reworked to fit your context. And so I think that would probably fit me because I don't have a whole lot of original ideas, but I work really hard at taking great ideas and making them fit our context.
I'm not going to. That's a great answer. That was far more profound than I thought it would be.
Not me Googling who is Handel.
And Michael, you have some experience with Handel because part of your story is that you're the executive pastor at the Orchard now. That was not your background in ministry prior to become the executive pastor at the Orchard. In fact, your degree is in
Music.
And your experience was in music, so much so that you participated in community choirs for Handel's Messiah Christmas.
Yeah. So in Lake City, we did that years ago and for many years. And so I started that pretty young, probably 14 or 15, something like that. And I grew up doing musical things as a high schooler, but I learned a love for music as an elementary school kid. My mom especially, loved music. And so that was just a part of my growing up. As I got saved and experienced what I felt like was a clear call to ministry, that passion for music began to grow and develop. And I went to music school, have a music degree, spent the first 5 or 6 years of my quote unquote professional life as a teacher, conductor, clinician, sometimes judge.
You were a doctor too?
Well,
what does clinician mean with music? Like you just completely threw me on that one.
Well, so I had fantastically hardworking and some very gifted kids. And so they were able to perform at a high level pretty quickly. And as a young guy, that gained me recognition that was probably undeserved, but it meant that I got to be put in positions of coaching, and working with other young conductors, choral directors,
Coaching podcast part 2. I love it.
Yeah, going to sometimes running festivals. They call them MPAs now, but where kids groups go perform, they get judged, and so I got to do some judging, some things like that.
That's awesome.
It was a fantastic experience for me. I learned a lot, and
so if we could just go back to last week when myself, Trey, and Corey had our conversation about coaching.
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing.
One of the points we talked about being an informal missionary is, and last week was sports, but that was an example, right? One of the points, though, is the reason that you have the ability to have influence as an informal missionary is because you speak the language, and everything Michael is saying, I have no idea what it means.
Yeah, if because we had video on this, you should see mine and Matt's faces when he's like talking about this. We're just like cow looking at a new fence.
Yeah,
like no idea.
Because I don't speak the language of music and composing and clinicking, or whatever the verb form of clinician is.
Yeah. Clinic.
But I think it just shows the value, though, of in the church, you have so many people who come together who have different backgrounds, different experiences, different passions and hobbies and gifts and talents. And so really, I mean, the opportunity to be an informal missionary inside the church, like there is no facet of life that cannot be impacted
That's right.
by the gospel, because you have so many people who, and we've talked about this before, the differences and yet unity in the church is what makes the church this unique organism, this unique living body, is that the foot is different from the hand. The coach of sports is different from the coach of music and composing and all of that. And yet it's the same gospel that brings us all together, and the same gospel that we can take to those different areas. So continue what you're saying, but I'm going to have to Google everything that you're saying.
Let me kind of nerd out for just a second on what you just said and why I think it's so important in today's culture. Because what technology has done for the world today is really compressed everyone into the same digital space. You know, we all live online. The world is smaller now than it's ever been in many ways. And because of that, we have seen an increase in niche hobby groups, or, you know, Seth Godin called it years ago when he wrote this book that took off, tribes, right? We live in a very tribal society because you can identify your people and connect with them better. And so whether that's baseball or music or disc golf or, you know, Yu-Gi-Oh card games or whatever it is, you can connect with those people. And so now I think what you just said, Matt, is truer than it may have ever been. Whatever your thing is, there is a group of people that you can leverage that for the sake of the gospel, because those people are grouped in more specific tribes now than we probably ever have been through history, because we're less bound by geography than we've ever been. And I think that's excellent.
I think a visual to informal missionaries, and I know that's not entirely our focus today, but if you could visualize it for just a second, I think the best visual for being an informal missionary is a Venn diagram, where you have two circles, and in one circle you have, maybe it's a hobby, maybe it's a passion, maybe it's a talent, and in the other circle is follower of Jesus. And yet Venn diagrams intersect in the middle. And so that is really where informal missionaries have their opportunities, is when the follower of Jesus intersects with whatever that hobby, that talent, that even to a degree, your workplace, your environment, because you speak that language. And so you have overlap in those areas. And in the middle is really where those opportunities exist.
Find your thing, find your people, leverage it for the gospel. 100%. That's really good. So let's go back, Michael.
Yeah. Well, let me kind of tag onto that. So I would say, and I'd have to really think about this, but I think as far as personally being able to be deeply involved in and having the most impact in ministry, it was in that time of my life.
Like you're talking about, like impacting the lives of people.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of what I do in the church, maybe it's more visible. Or at least when I was more involved in music in the church, it was more visible. But the issue is often the church is so segregated from the rest of the world that our impact gets limited as pastors because our time and our efforts get dominated by the work of the church.
Isn't it so interesting though that every church thinks like we have, like we're the nicest church, we're the friendliest church, we're the most welcoming church, and yet, I mean, really and truly inside the walls of the church, and I don't think it's intentional, but it is in a sense exclusive to the world versus, okay, I'm Chip, the baseball coach, and now I'm surprised to find out you're a pastor because in this
Not
environment,
because I cuss kids. I've never cussed a child.
yeah, but it's just this, in this environment, you're like me. You're one of us, you know, like there is no expectation. And then I'm surprised to find out that you're a pastor. And I think it's probably true in that environment. I'm just composing, I'm just leading students, I'm teaching students about music. And then there's this organic, you know, nature to that type of ministry. I will say this too, and I know we need to move on to what we're really talking about today. But I think too, it also conveys like ministry doesn't have to be boring. Ministry doesn't have to be tedious. I mean, I'm not saying it's not hard work at times. I'm not saying that sometimes you got to roll up your sleeves and there's a blue collar mentality
There's
to
some
ministry.
stuff you just have to do.
But the reality is, if you minister in this way, ministry can be fun. I mean, ministry in the context of coaching, I'm sure you don't coach because you hate it.
No.
I'm sure you weren't composing musicals for the community because, wow, this is a real
To be clear, I was not composing musicals for the community.
Yeah, but just that.
Being musicals.
Yeah.
Is this, Matt, is this your like way of telling us that you got a new boat and named it Visitation or something like that? So you're going to be out on visitation a lot?
No, but that's a good idea.
I knew a pastor who had such a thing.
Really?
And, oh gosh, yes. Another guy played golf all the time, and his line to the secretary as he left to go play on Wednesday afternoons was going to visit the greens.
Yes. Well, checks out. So, let's kind of take the conversation, rewind back to the beginning. Music was at the forefront of your ministry, but you were also working in the schools, doing other things. And part of that is because doing other things in ministry was because you got started in ministry at a very young age. How old were you when you started serving in the local church in a ministry leadership kind of capacity?
15.
15. See, that's one of the cool things I like about the Orchard is a lot of us here at the Orchard got started in those teenage years, and that is a crazy, crazy dynamic. 15, though, big deal. Was it because you were the only one in the church that could read music, or?
No, it wasn't that I was the only one that could read music, but I was one of very few. And so it provided opportunities that it's the big fish in a very little pond kind of situation.
Yeah. Well, and that's honestly how sometimes we get thrust into ministry is by necessity, and that's, I think God uses that.
Absolutely. And I think, to be clear, I think we should, as a church, should be doing more of that. I think the best way to involve teenagers is to help them find a place of service that they're passionate about, because that often is going to carry throughout their life, and it's a way for them to serve and be deeply connected to the church.
Yeah, and I'm seeing that real time right now firsthand in my life with Haddon, my 14-year-old, who is getting connected with our media booth on Sunday mornings, to the point that I was preaching in Live Oak because you guys just had the baby, right? And Leanne was sick at home and couldn't get to church. I still was able, because Haddon was serving and locked in and ready to go, dropped him off at church before I left to go preach in Live Oak here. Dropped him off here in Lake City. And Trey carried him back home after church, and he stayed and served both services. So as a 14-year-old, he's getting up, at 6:30 to get ready to go to church, serve, be there all day, be home by lunch, because 14, he wants to serve. And that's really cool to see. So Michael, run us down, real quick. I know it could be a full podcast series, because you've been in ministry a long time.
Yeah, I get what you're saying. You're trying to say I'm very old.
I didn't say that. I just said you started at 15. But no, run us through like what your ministry trail, so to speak, that led you to where you are today. So 15, serving in church, lead music. Where does Michael go from there?
Yeah, so he does a lot of that. He has some part-time jobs as he gets to be a little bit older, go to college, do the music school thing, served churches all the way through college. And then when I graduated, I taught and served as a volunteer in church for couple years, I think at least, before I came back to vocational ministry. And then I did both for a while. That's a recipe for disaster when you're married, by the way. 100-hour weeks are not healthy for young married people.
You're 100% spot on. And by the way, let's just say thankful for a church culture I didn't create, I inherited, but a church culture that realizes that for our young staff members and encourages that. Like, hey, we're not saying we don't want your hours to be busy. We're just saying we don't want all your hours.
Yeah. And so I spent a lot of time trying to develop skills and learn, spent a lot of time reading, trying to be around people who could pour into me. And so, interesting story. I had gotten to spend some time at a conference, and Jim Whitwire was there. Jim was Adrian Rogers' worship leader for, 40 years, something like that.
Adrian Rogers, love that guy.
Super.
Love that guy.
Yeah, stick around. I may use a quote from him.
Hey.
So I was at a roundtable lunch with Jim, and as a super young guy, Jim said something that was interesting to me. He said, a lot of you young guys are praying for God to send you to a church or to the next church or the next bigger thing. And he said, I think a better, more effective, and maybe a more biblical way to approach that is to be praying for God to put you with people, right? To serve with specific people. And if you're in a staff support role or you're a second guy, whatever, pray that God would help you basically pair up with a guy that you can serve with over a long time, because ministry happens best in a long context. And so that was kind of challenging to me and my thinking, because I'd never heard that before, thought about that. And not long after that, had an opportunity to do music for a revival meeting. And there was this guy preaching named Eddie Blaylock.
Heard of him.
Never heard of him.
Yep. So Eddie was preaching on Mark chapter 2. And man, he said some things that probably helped lay the foundation for God to work eventually, at least in my thinking and my own spiritual development, to get to the place where I could be a part of starting the Orchard with him. Because I was a traditional music guy, focused on the traditional church and loved the traditional church. But one of the things that, he said in that message was the church is too focused on the church. We're not focused enough on the people outside the church. And that was challenging for me, and so anyway, during that message, I thought, man, if Jim's right, this is the guy. I mean, he's got the heart. He's challenging my thinking. It was just a kind of a strange thought, let it pass. And so years later, the Orchard starts, and here we are. And
so you were able to partner up with Eddie as the Orchard was being planted.
Yes.
And when you're planting a church, there's no clean job roles, ministry positions. So you were doing music when you guys started the church, but you were doing more than music. So what did that look like in that season?
Well, to be honest, at this point, a lot of it's a blur.
PTSD, or just it was moving so fast? Or
yes and yes. No, my goal really was, I spent a lot of time with Eddie because I really felt like if I could learn where his heart was on things, I could help with decision making and take a lot of things off his plate. And so I tried to do that. Also ask him specifically, hey, what are the things that only you can do? Because I want to help you manage all of the other things, because, I have a strong conviction that preaching is a very important and maybe in many ways one of the most important components of corporate worship and certainly church life.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to make sure he had plenty of time to study, to prepare. I wanted to know how long it took him to do that. What were the things that I could do? And so in my mind and sometimes on paper, I outlined, every week or every month, the things that, I thought were most important for him to do. And I tried to do everything else.
Yeah. I think that it sounds like that was really, as you already said, you embracing that call to be the second guy in many ways, and I hate that terminology, but understand what you mean when you say that. Like Eddie was the lead pastor, the church planter, preaching on Sunday mornings, in a lot of ways the face of what was happening, but you felt a specific calling to support that in whatever way you needed to.
Well, yeah, absolutely. My call is to serve the church, but I think the best way, and specifically in that season, and still I feel this way, even with you, some of maybe even the most important part of my call is to do a good job of supporting the lead pastor and providing him with, the information, the other things that he needs, or to just make it so he doesn't have to think about a lot of things so that he can focus on the things he's called to do.
Well, I think in a lot of ways that is the transition point to where you're at today because you are no longer in quote unquote music ministry.
True.
Right? You did lead worship at the Lake City location for how many first years of the Orchard?
So we are coming up to completing 18 years.
That's right.
And so May, a couple weeks ago would have been 9 years since the last time I was responsible for service programming, worship leading on a weekly basis.
So that means then for the first 9 years of the church, you were the primary worship leader, especially here in Lake City. But now your title is Executive Pastor.
Yeah.
What the heck does that mean?
Yeah, that's a great question. That was a conversation that Eddie and I had several times, many times maybe, early on, was that, the way that this is going and growing and kind of a little bit scary, out of control, it feels like.
Building the airplane while we're flying it.
Absolutely. So there was conversation around, at some point, and I knew music probably was going to be something that I had to let go. And so that day finally came where it was just not manageable to try to continue to do that along with everything else, because you begin to feel like you're doing a lot of things, but you're not doing a great job at anything.
Well, 100+ hour work weeks aren't good for non-young married couples either.
Yeah, my wife appreciated that. But it did take a lot of adjustment because, just to be transparent, that was a huge part of my identity for, even before I was officially leading and serving in a church, I was serving in music capacities, just as a volunteer.
Well, and that's something that's really important, and maybe that's another podcast for another day, is how much of our identity, especially for those of us in ministry, revolve around aspects of what we do.
Yeah.
You felt that with the music. Mm-hmm. Eddie has confessed on the podcast, as we've talked, that he felt that in many ways when he and I made the transition of lead pastor. And even guys who were used to preaching every single week, when they are not preaching every single week, so that's a thing. Yeah.
So, for a long time, I thought that was unique to men. I mean, kind of a male thing that we carried what we do as part of our identity. My dad recently retired, and it's a big adjustment to, getting a paycheck every week or on a regular basis, or just being, a leader in any capacity. And then that stops, and it's often abruptly. And so I've heard older guys as they retire say that for a long time. I'll never forget the Sunday after, when I woke up, after at that point 35 years of waking up on Sunday very early, thinking, preparing, for worship leading and, what the day was like.
Tea with honey to loosen the vocal cords.
Yeah, never did that. But so
You're thinking of Tom Brady.
That's good. That's really good.
Yeah. So it was a shock to my system. And I would even say, it was, again, transparently, it affected my spiritual life. It affected my emotional life. It was a huge, huge transition. It immediately started to get better, but to be clear, it took months and months for that feeling of sort of lostness on Sunday to just kind of go away. And for me to...
if I'm not doing music, what am I doing?
Well, it wasn't that, but I went from serving, wide open on Sundays to I had zero responsibilities on Sundays, other than show up, kind of,
Make sure nothing's burning down.
meet, greet, hang out with people, which I enjoy, but it was just very, very different.
Yeah.
And so
Much slower paced.
And, just to be honest, I think, this is a maybe an everybody thing, but again, I think for a lot of us guys, when you go from being needed or necessary and then all of a sudden you're not needed, it's, it's like,
That is one of the most...
it's like Matthew as a star baseball player, playing.
Use that adjective very loosely.
Yeah. Starting every game.
Player.
And then, suddenly he ends up on the bench and he's just sitting there. And so you begin to kind of wonder and reevaluate, man, is this the right thing? And so it was a big transition.
It is one of the shadow sides of ministry that does not get talked about often enough, is how the position of pastor in the modern Western church really fosters an environment for codependency to flourish. Mm-hmm. And man, we don't talk about that enough because we're all susceptible to it. Like, if I'm not needed by you,
You're not saying that as a compliment.
No.
Like, this is not a positive.
No, this is a bad thing because, like you said, our identity can't be in what we do. Our identity can't be in how other people see us or need us. Our identity is in Jesus alone. And we know that, but it doesn't stop that tension that is always trying to creep, into your heart in ministry. And again, this is another massive conversation for another day, but I will say that I feel like, Michael, you handled that transition well. It was obvious that it was a transition, but I think that part of how you handled that transition so well is by really beginning to embrace the executive pastor side of that role and carving that out, because there's not a lot of churches in our North Central Florida region that have executive pastors. You get to be a part of some executive pastor cohorts where you talk with other guys. Yeah. In many ways, what you do as an executive pastor is probably a little bit different than what they do as an executive pastor. So for somebody listening to this podcast, calls the Orchard home, I know Michael's our executive pastor. I've seen him around. What does you being an executive pastor at the Orchard look like?
Well, can I say something that I don't know if Michael will say this. So I will say it and then I'll let you expound, because in your humility, I don't know if you would say it this way. But this is something that I see, that I observe. For one, let me just say this, and we talked about it before. There's a sense in which churches do this thing where if you are on staff, you're automatically a pastor. And we would say that is not what we think is meant by the title in the office of pastor. Right?
Correct.
Like for us, when we say pastor, we mean something very specific, that it is
a biblical office.
It is a biblical office with biblical qualifications and responsibilities. And so when you hear executive pastor, it's not, he just does all of the administrative stuff and, he works at a church, so let's just call him a pastor. That's not what we mean when we say executive pastor.
A Western church has been, if you're a guy working at the church, you're a pastor. If you're a woman working at the church, you're a director. And in that, we have lost what the biblical office of
We've lost
pastor
it.
is.
Yeah. We kind of tongue in cheek say this, but like, oh, well, I'm the maintenance pastor because I take care of all the grounds and stuff. Like,
Honestly, never heard of that. But
you know
that's
what I
great.
mean? But like,
that's great.
That's how churches approach this sometimes. And we would say, no, you can just be head of the grounds or whatever without the title of pastor. You know, we say that because we think that title and that office is very specific. And so when you hear us talk about Michael's the executive pastor, he is a pastor, qualified in that way, but also the responsibilities and his heart. And so the way I describe it is really the way that I see it. And, you know, we have a working relationship in this dynamic, but really, like, I see you as a pastor of pastors. Like I feel the effect and the impact that you have on you pastor our staff, and you do that with love. You do that with truth. You do that with grace. You do that holding us accountable and asking the hard questions. But I know that it comes from a place of, number one, that first and foremost, I belong to Jesus. And then secondly, we're all in this thing together, and we want to make sure that we are following God, that we're being good stewards of what he's given us, you know, financially, but also opportunistically. And so before you expound, I would say for our people, if you're like, yeah, I've seen Michael, I've heard his name, but I don't really know what he does or who he is, I would say it this way, if I could define it. He is a pastor of pastors. And that's the role that I think he, for me personally, that's kind of the role that I feel that impact of, yes, you're taking care of a lot of responsibilities and things, but you also care for us as pastors, and you want what's best for us. Your favorite thing to say is, how can I help you? What can I do to help you? You know, and I feel that. So hopefully that's helpful.
I thought his favorite thing to say was pitiful. Or is that just me?
I'm not in those conversations.
Yeah, my granddaughter would agree.
Yeah, so that's good. I think that's a very accurate description, that the pastor side of that is more important than the executive side of that. And maybe it's a good time to say, you know, the way we set up as a multi-site church here at the Orchard is that we have a team of pastors that lead our church. I am the lead pastor. Michael's the executive pastor. You and Eddie are right now our location pastors. Those are the pastors of the Orchard. And it's not that you are the Live Oak pastor and you work at the Orchard. You are a pastor of the Orchard and you serve in Live Oak, right? You know, and I think that is a very important distinction. When we say pastor, we mean it. But the executive side of it does look a little bit different because, Michael, you don't preach every Sunday, and, you know, you're not always with a microphone in your hand. So then what are some of those areas of responsibility that you help oversee?
Yeah. So first, Matt, thanks. That's humbling. But that has really, even with Eddie in the beginning, that was my heart, because pastors often feel like, and I think it's absolutely true, that they give and give and give and feel often where they come up, you know, kind of empty on the backside of that. And so I've really tried to focus on being a support for you guys, and making sure that, you know, there's somebody who's asking you some of the things that help to bring those out, because part of pastoring is loving and leading people to health, right? Spiritual, emotional health, some of those things. And so I just want to, hopefully I can help guard and guide in some ways that help you guys just stay healthy. Because if our pastors are not healthy, if their marriages aren't healthy, if they're not leading in healthy ways, then we're going to fail as a church. And not in the sense that we're failing, quote unquote, people, but we're failing you as pastors, because we should be loving and serving you as much as we love and serve everybody else.
I'll give you a real world instance from this past Sunday. I'm getting ready to walk out. Everything's kind of done, locking up, cleaning up. And so I'm sliding out after the second service. And some of the guys who help count and deposit on Sundays and all that. And one of them was just joking. He was like, yeah, I'll take the deposit bag, because we deposit every Sunday. And he was joking with me. He's like, well, unless Matt wants to do it. And I responded in that moment. You know, I knew he was joking, but I responded with something that you say all the time. And you say all the time for guys, because you pastor pastors, you want us to be aware of these things as well. You say there's two things in ministry that will get you fired. What are they?
Money and sex.
Yeah. Money and sex, or money and women. Right.
Yep.
And so I jokingly, I knew the guy was joking, But my first thought was, this is something that Michael says routinely, because the heart is, you don't want anybody to experience the hard life lesson of falling victim to one of those two things. And so I jokingly told him, I was like, well, honestly, I try not to handle money because, there are opportunities, in those two realms, especially in the past. And you see it in the headlines. I mean, these things unfortunately happen far too often.
Yeah.
But it was just funny because in this moment, I'm just reacting, and I'm immediately, that is the thought that came to my mind. And it's something that you say all the time. And I think it's just a good context for, like, this is who Michael is. As when I say pastor of pastors, that's what I mean. Those are conversations that we have routinely and organically, because your heart is, I don't want you guys to experience this.
That's right.
Yeah. And the other side of that is that Michael is the one in the executive part of that pastor role that sets up those systems to help make that happen. Right. So, systems for us as far as personnel systems for us financially. Michael's primary, let me get this right, fiduciary for the orchard. As executive pastor, he oversees, our finances, working with our management team, to make sure not that we aren't spending money, or saving as much money as we can, because that's the wrong definition of stewardship. Stewardship is not put as much money in the bank as we can. It's put it in the right place to have the biggest impact. But because money is such a touchy issue with churches often, we want to make sure that we're always above reproach with those things. Absolutely. And so Michael sets up systems to help us do that and to be accountable and to be above reproach. And that is a complicated job at any church, much less one with 3 different locations.
Yeah. So there's, a lot of moving parts to what I do. And some days, if you were to ask me what I did that day, I probably would not be able to recall everything that happened. I spend a lot of time, just trying to troubleshoot by asking questions and seeing where we are on things. But yes, setting up systems, making sure that we're following our systems. And, that includes everything from insurance, facilities, maintenance, making sure that, we're getting
purchases.
Yeah. All of those things. And so, but one of the things that I enjoy most about what I'm doing is pastoring our staff. And that goes beyond, you guys as pastors. We've got a daycare. We're involved loosely with the management of the skating rink. And so, my being able to interact with the staff there, specifically the leaders in those areas, and just trying to support and love on them and make sure that, they have what they need as well. So that's a lot of the most rewarding parts of what I do. Another thing that I'm passionate about, and, it's easy for churches to kind of turn inward or focus on inward things. And so, I think one of the things that God's gifted me with is a little bit of an eye that sees outward, or how outsiders maybe see people inside the church. And so I'm passionate about making sure that we're getting mission dollars to organizations that we feel like are effective, and partnering with ministry partners, locally and regionally. So
that's good. I think, Matt, you described it as a pastor. I'll tell you how I've, viewed Michael, and Michael and I have talked about his role through, through our transition into my role as the lead pastor. And that was a transition for Michael as much as it was, Eddie and I, in a lot of ways, personally, in the relationship side of it. Michael takes the role of an older brother for me a lot of times. And organizationally, as I am the visionary, vision caster, dreamer, Michael is the guy that I look at to say, all right, now help me get this done. Let's put this into practice. Let's make this happen. Michael's that guy. But maybe the best way to explain it is conversation I had with AJ. If you know AJ and Michael, what you would be shocked by is that they are far more alike than anybody would ever guess. But you don't see that because it's not surface level alikeness, because surface level, Michael and AJ are maybe the most opposite people that you've ever met. And that combination just frankly led to the butting of heads a few times. And one time in particular, AJ was very frustrated with Michael, and it was 100% Michael holding AJ accountable to something that needed to be done. But in AJ's eyes, does it really need to be done? You know, that kind of thing. And I said, AJ, hop in the truck with me. And we were driving somewhere towards town. I don't even remember where we were driving, but I remember looking over at AJ and telling him this: AJ, guys like you and I meant a little bit scattered, head in the sky, you know, running 90 miles an hour without a plan sometimes. I said, guys like us need guys like Michael, or else we're going to burn everything down. And I think that clicked for him, you know, is you need the guys who are going to help hold you accountable, make you work a system. Let's talk about how we get this done, not just a what if, and to keep things healthy. And so, you know, that's my description of Michael. Michael is the guy, and I say this jokingly, but also there's a lot of truth in describing what he does. Michael is the guy who makes sure that we're not burning everything down at the orchard, that it actually functions. I say that and, you know, just immediately wondered, I wonder if we ever have burnt anything down at the orchard. I don't think so. Nothing's ever caught fire.
No.
Okay. No. Okay. Well, I do want to get to this, and this has been a great conversation up to this point, but I do want to get to the financial side of it, because you really are our financial expert at the orchard. You know, you and Aaron, you know, and Mary handle all of that, but part of what you do working with the management team in the financial stewardship side of the church is you're the guy who in a lot of our meetings is pushing the idea of generosity. And generosity has been a core idea behind what we're trying to do with Impact Tomorrow. So I've got a question I want to throw at you, and I want you to answer it in two parts. The question is, why does generosity matter? But I want you to answer that in two parts, because one is generosity matters for us as followers of Jesus, as individuals. So why does generosity matter to us personally? But then the second one is, why does generosity matter for us, like as a church, corporately, as an organization? Why is that so important? Yeah. So I know that's kind of a big question. It's intended to be a big question. I just want to let you run with that. Why does generosity matter?
Well, so personally, I think the reason that generosity matters is because we are born to give. And when I say that, I don't mean from a natural standpoint, but when we are born again, to use some old biblical language, we are born to be generous. That is part of that new life that is supposed to be a part of every believer. And so I think that's the key, but it comes in a couple of different ways. One is through obedience. And so just talking about spiritual discipline in general, right? So the focus of a lot of the don'ts or the do's in Scripture have to do with our flesh wanting to make us the God of our universe, right? And so the point of so many of those things is to remind us and help us be in a better position to realize, remember, and recognize that God is before all things, right? All these other things can become idols in our lives.
There's a God, it's not us.
That's absolutely right. And so I think that's a key part. And so, you know, then comes the question, well, what about Old Testament tithing and all of this stuff? Well, you know, the fact is, I think it's a biblical thing. I think it's a matter of obedience. And so does it have to be a tithe? You know, I think that's debatable. I think people would argue that. I think Scripture uses that as a baseline or a level of expected giving. But the point of that is not to take 10% of your money or to take a specific amount of your money or percentage of your money. The point of that is to remove God or remove money as the God that we tend to put before other things.
Yeah, because it's not just pastors who get in trouble with money and sex.
Absolutely.
Those are two of the main downfalls morally in the life of everybody.
Absolutely. And so, to take that a little bit further, you know, when we are born again, right, Spirit indwells us. If you listen to MacArthur or these other guys, not only the Spirit, but the triune God inhabits us, right? And so there then becomes this issue of spiritual fruit. And so what we often do is just expect fruit to show up. And I think in some cases it can. I think in all cases, it is a matter of sanctification or spiritual formation. And so that often comes, and I think best comes through spiritual disciplines. If you want to experience love, joy, peace, those things in your life, a lot of times some of that just does not come naturally. And so there's some spiritual discipline, some tending our garden or our orchard that helps to produce and bring out that fruit in our life, right?
I see what you did there. That was nice.
Well, you know me. And so the point being, though, if I'm having trouble loving somebody that just grates my nerves, man, the best thing I can do is develop the discipline or the practice of praying for that person. And you've heard it said many times before, often it's not God changing that person, it's God changing us and our heart toward that person. And so in the same way, if we want to experience peace in the area of finances, sometimes the best thing that we can do is take that money thing out of the center of our heart, and place God back in his rightful position. And so developing the discipline of giving, I think, helps us to do that.
Yeah, generosity is more than finances.
Absolutely.
It's not less than finances. And giving is about making sure put it like this, maybe this is old school, but I believe it's accurate. If Jesus doesn't have your wallet, he doesn't have your heart.
It's true.
That may sound unkind, unfair, harsh, but I believe it's true,
Well, there's words in your Bible that are in red, and it's Jesus speaking, and he says you can't serve two masters.
That's right.
And his point is not this. Let's acknowledge, first of all, there are churches and there are pastors who have leveraged and perverted scripture to get rich. Let's just acknowledge that.
That's right.
But that doesn't negate what the Bible does say about generosity. It doesn't say, like when Jesus says this, the reason those words are in red is because Jesus knows that there is a lure for the human heart that gravitates to money, right? There is something natural inside of us in our sin nature that gravitates to greed and selfishness, and it's mine, right? And in Jesus, you have experienced the lavishness of grace. Freely you've been given, freely you've been extended. Jesus tells a parable, and the parable is about forgiveness, ultimately salvation and experience, the experience of forgiveness. And he tells the story about two debtors. He uses money to convey this idea that you have been extended forgiveness, which is a forgiveness of debt. We understand these concepts of money, and Jesus uses that to ultimately point to salvation. And then you almost reverse engineer when you talk about generosity in the New Testament, because you've experienced salvation, because you've been forgiven a debt that you could never repay, then it frees you up to be generous. And generosity, like you said, Chip, it's not just about money. It's not less than that. Generosity is an attitude, and it's an attitude that flows out of an experience of salvation. Because I've been forgiven, because I've experienced salvation in Jesus, it frees me up to be generous with my money, yes, but to be generous with my time, to be generous with myself. I extend my energy and my effort, my talent to invest in the people around me. Generosity is an attitude that is reverse engineered out of salvation. And so the idea here is that as believers, we have the opportunity to be generous, right?
Yeah,
it's a desire that's birthed in us because of our salvation.
Yeah, I think that's 100% spot on. Like the opportunity, not the obligation. And the second thing, just to double click on what you just said, is when we're talking about the spiritual discipline of giving, what we're not saying is you need to sow a seed of $999.99, and God's going to bless you. You're going to get that new car. You're going to get that promotion. You're going to find. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is the spiritual fruit that Michael talked about that comes from obedience is what it does in our heart and for
absolutely.
our heart, not what it does for our bank account. So if you're giving just to get from God, then you have made God a vending machine at best and a slot machine at worst. But what we're talking about is the discipline of obedience in the realm of finances is that God is very aware how much our hearts are inclined to hoard, to spend on our own desires, to focus on self as the center of the universe. And if he can get us to let go of that debit card, as you know, that means of funneling and fueling ourselves, it brings a freedom, it brings a generosity, it creates that fruit in us, not just for us.
When you've experienced the treasure stored up in heaven, you learn to devalue the treasures of earth that are moth eaten and rust destroyed.
Yeah, it drives me crazy when I hear these televangelists, and because it's podcasts and I can, Jesse Duplantis brag about the size of his house. I got the biggest house of all these preachers. Come look at my. Jesus didn't have a house. Mm-hmm. Jesus was homeless. Yeah. The Son of Man has no place to lay his head. Mm-hmm. So you reconcile that in your theology and just see where you land.
Yeah. Well, to be clear, to go back in the idea of you can serve God or you can serve money, right? If you are giving to get, you are not serving God, or God is That's not right. on the throne of your heart, right? Money is still there because That's you're seeing right. this as a purely physical, financial, transactional relationship, and that is not what generosity or even tithing is all about.
And it's not a test either.
Absolutely.
It's not. God says, test me in this, but it's not a test of, well, God wants to see if you really do trust him.
If you really believe in what Matt described and what Chip was just talking about, and you can go to the slums of Kenya and see some of the godly people there who have wrapped their minds around the preaching that you're talking about, because they see it on television, when they go to places. And so you cannot continue to, I think, believe that or espouse that thought when you've been there and you see people who have given up everything that they have, and yet they are just desperate.
Everybody's favorite verse, Philippians 4:13, right?
Yeah.
In the context of that verse, Paul is saying this: I have learned the secret to being content.
That's right.
Whether I have an abundance or I have nothing.
Yeah.
Yep.
That I can do all things through Christ, because Jesus is the substance who informs every other facet of my life. And that includes my wallet, my time, my energy, my effort, my talent, my gifts, everything that I do. The source and what is central to all of this is Jesus.
Absolutely.
And he informs everything else in our lives.
To say it in the old school way and to quote there, godliness with contentment is great gain, right?
Yeah, that's good. That's real good. So we're running out of time here, but I do want you to talk about why generosity matters for us as a church as well.
So kind of transition there. Let's just talk about, we have a number of people in our church who give at all levels to support the ministry, to help us support other ministries and missions. And so, I think talking about giving and generosity in a personal way, one of the ways that I try to think about that is I look at it as my spiritual 401k, right? And I think to some degree we do that as a church. We intentionally develop or have developed let's call it a portfolio of
one
ministries.
Might say an eternity portfolio.
That's right.
That was a book that Eddie was passionate about for a long time.
Yeah, it's out of print now, but it's that idea of partnering with specific ministries and mission organizations and being intentional about investing there. And I feel like as a church, as we really lean into impacting lostness in our region and continuing to serve and give to mission, outside of our region, I think that is part of what believers are called to do. I think Scripture clearly indicates that we are generously blessed with stuff, let's call it. And when I say that, let's not forget that God owns it all. right? Even when it's called your stuff. And so the idea of being able to allocate that to organizations or to churches that can and are being intentional about impacting lostness and serving people who have great needs, I think is extremely important. And I think kind of circling back to that spiritual fruit idea, when you get to the place where you can do that, I think your experience of joy, peace, particularly in the area of giving, becomes greater.
Yeah, I think too, when you look at even in Acts, and Acts is the book where the church is born, so to speak. We sing a song, I love it, King of Kings, and the Church of Christ was born when the Spirit lit the flame. And you see this almost like documentary, right, of the birth of the church and this gathering of believers, and they're just figuring it out. They're just kind of figuring it all out, and you go and you read through that story in Acts, and when you look at the book of Acts, you see generosity come out, and it's born from a desire, not an obligation. Yeah. It's born from a desire where the people are selling and they're bringing it, the profits that they make, they're bringing it, and it says they're laying it at the apostles' feet. And what was the point of that? To go into meet needs, real tangible ministry needs.
That's right.
And I think when we talk about generosity corporately, one of the things that I love about the Orchard, and I know, as we talk about your role specifically, Michael, that I know your heart is generosity. That I think back just a couple of weeks ago where I texted when you told us how much money was given to the pregnancy care center. I texted back and I said, is that 15,000 or did you put too many zeros?
Yeah.
Because to me, that's a staggering number for a week's notice of giving specifically to an organization that we believe in, an organization that has an impact that we would say extends even beyond what we can do. And yet we get to partner with an agency and an organization like the Pregnancy Care Center because we believe that they have the opportunity to have real impact in the people who walk through their doors. And this is an impact that maybe we can't even have, at least in this sphere. And so we don't have to be the center of attention. Let's just give and partner with them.
That's right.
Yeah.
And so because of generosity at the personal level, we have the ability to, like the book of Acts, born out of a desire to meet a need. Now, corporately, we can be generous and we can partner with an agency that we believe has a real ministry impact in our communities.
Well, I think that this is a good way to kind of bring this full circle back to the idea of impact tomorrow. When Michael and I first sat down and started talking about the idea of impact tomorrow, and if I remember right, Michael is the one brought it to the table. Hey, let's think through this. One of the first commitments that we made as lead pastor, executive pastor, is that this was not a giving campaign.
That's right.
We're not doing this to just raise money. Now, full transparency, because if you've made it this far, you're probably bought in at the Orchard. If we're going to reach more people, and if we're going to have a further reach into our region, it is going to cost more money. Money that is currently not in our budget because we only budget what we have, So do we need to increase our giving at the Orchard if we're going to reach the mission field that we feel called to reach? 100%. However, this is not a giving campaign. Right. This is not just about raising money and getting financial commitments. And one of the first commitments that Michael and I made around the idea of impact tomorrow was that a chunk of whatever we do, we are just going to go ahead and give away to ministry and mission partners. We're going to set that aside. It's going to be a percentage that goes, because if this is true of what we're asking people personally, it needs to be true of us organizationally, because we need to do what we're asking them to do. And so that was a big part of that. And that's why, Michael, we have already made a commitment to increase our budget.
That's right.
Specifically in the realm of ministry and mission partnerships.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, the idea behind that is as churches ramp up their inside focus, so often those outside partnerships and support for those other things gets pushed aside or squeezed down. And we just didn't want to do that. As a matter of fact, we wanted to double down and we wanted to go big and do more and stay committed to that and let that be, our first giving, our first fruits, our commitment up front. We're going to do this regardless of what it means to the rest of what we can do because we believe so much in that.
Yeah, I'm put you on the spot. How much have we committed to increase our budget in those area ministry and mission partnerships?
Yeah, so
quickly.
Yeah, so we came to the table a little bit late in our budget planning for this year, and so we were only able to get up to, I think it was about $144,000 additional dollars.
That's what I thought. Yeah, right around 150 additional this year.
Yeah, and so that was what we were certainly able to commit. Our management team immediately bought into that. They were excited about that.
And let's hold on. Let's not fly past that. $150,000 additional dollars to ministry and mission partners. Continue.
Yeah. So to be clear, because Chip is, you may have said it before, Chip, he's clarity, I'm certainty. And so let's be certain.
That means Michael is 99.9% certain before he says anything.
Yeah.
I'm 51% certain, but I'll say it really clearly.
And loudly.
Loudly.
Yeah. So to be clear, though, it is $144,000 additional dollars. Now, that doesn't include the special things that happen where, at kind of the last minute, we decided the pregnancy care center, I just felt like it was a good opportunity for us to do that. We hadn't done a special thing like, they have the baby bottle boomerang that a lot of churches do. And that's a difficult thing for us to manage as a multi-site church. And so we brought that to the table late, and as just out of pocket additional giving from our people, it was that $15,000. And so that was really exciting for me, but we're committed to doubling down on that and staying committed to that.
And the years forward, we're trying to push that. And so if you're listening to this, we want you to hear, what Michael said and what Matt has just said. Matt almost said it verbatim. We as a church are only able to be as generous as you who attend our church are generous, because we are not funded by anything other than what you give online or in the box. That's how we're funded. And so our generosity is tied to your generosity as an individual. And one of the things that we've asked in Impact Tomorrow, not lightly, because we are aware how touchy money is in church circles and how it has been abused in a lot of church circles, but we have asked that you, pray about and consider what it looks like for you to take your next step of giving here at the Orchard. Because if we all who call the Orchard home and want to invest in the mission take our next step in giving, then it will allow our church to take a giant next step in our generosity. Yeah. And so, we've laid out some steps that I think are helpful. If you've never given anything before, maybe just give something for the very first time. If you give as you think about it for special things like the Pregnancy Care Center, we'd encourage you, maybe your next step is to just give regularly, every paycheck, every month, whatever. Just begin to build that habit. If you have given out of habit, we say your next step is probably to give intentionally. That means that we're getting to what the Old Testament and the New Testament use as measuring sticks for giving, which is first before anything else, percentage-based giving. This is intentional. I'm doing this percentage before everything else because it's not going to be dependent giving. And then for those of you who do give intentionally, percentage-based, have for a while, everything beyond that, man, that really is generosity. And so anything above and beyond that is a big deal. And so whatever that next step is for you, if you take that next step, it helps us as our church take our next step. And Michael is the guy who can help talk you through some of that, because I will say, knowing Michael's heart, he's willing to have those conversations and sit down with you. If you're wondering, hey, what does that look like for me? Michael is a great resource to have those conversations.
Yeah. So I'd love to be able to do that with you. I can't really give you advice. I could tell you what I would do and maybe ask some questions that help you come to some maybe financially healthy conclusions. But the key thing is, if you're in a hole, stop digging. Try to find some ways to.
Saturday Night Live had a great skit on. You remember that? It was a great skit on this new plan to get out of debt and grow your financial wealth. The plan, and it's a Saturday Night Live skit. The plan was called "Don't Buy Stuff You Can't Afford."
Yeah, yeah, and that may sound a little just offhand. If you're in a situation where you're struggling, Absolutely. I'd love to talk to you about that. I have told this story many times, especially as leading some budget boot camp type classes and things like that. When my wife and I first got married, first 4 months, man, we were buying groceries on a credit card. I mean, it was just a struggle, but we had made some commitments. One of those commitments was to give and to figure out how to spend less than we were making. Another commitment was we're gonna invest in, the future, meaning we're going to find a way to save. And so it was a hole to start with, but man, God was so faithful to us, and we really tried to work through the obedience thing. And eventually it got where it needed to go and started heading in a much more healthy direction. And here's what I would say. When you commit to being generous, I really do feel like your financial world begins to shift, and you begin to see things, I think, a little bit more clearly. I think you start to make healthier decisions. And to go back to Adrian Rogers, and just, I'm not sure I would say it exactly like this, but Adrian Rogers has been quoted many times as saying that he said this: I'd rather have 90% and God's blessing rather than 100% without it. And so I'm not sure I'd say it quite that strongly, but he was committed to it. And I really do believe that God is faithful when we're faithful.
Yeah, 100%. And so if those conversations that you'd like to have, reach out to us. We're here to have those conversations. But above all, generosity is who you are, not just what you give.
That's absolutely true.
And that's something that we want to be true of us as a church. But the only way that's true of us as a church is if that's true of those who call the Orchard home.
Yeah. And let me say this. I mentioned the idea of the spiritual investment that goes along with giving. When you give, and the church is able to support these ministries and missionaries and those kind of things, your fingerprint is with that money all the way. And so, I mean, you have, it's a little spiritualized to say this, but I really believe this. You have a direct part in that ministry and the fruit that comes from that ministry. And so that's why we're committed to that. That's why we're committed to telling the stories of those ministry partners and helping you see what their work really looks like.
Yeah. Paul calls it, I think it's in Philippians, your partnership in the gospel.
That's right. So maybe, to wind us down, Michael, you'd like to lead us out of here by singing 1988 hit by Ray Boltz, Thank You for Giving to the Lord.
Well, I wish I could say that I have never sung that song.
Yeah, you have.
But I will not be singing it today.
Yeah, you have. All right. Well, hey, it really has been a good conversation. The one thing that I do want you all to know is that Michael was worried that he wouldn't have anything to say on the podcast. And here we are, an hour, 10 plus minutes in, and it's a good conversation. We could have gone longer, but we won't, because if you're living in Lake City, Live Oak, or Branford, chances are you've already got to where you were going by the time we finish this podcast. So I hope you'll join us back. We got some more great conversations lined up for the summer and stories about what God does in our lives to bring us living, loving more like Jesus. All right. So we'll catch you guys later.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of Let's Talk About That. We hope it encouraged and challenged you as we continue to grow on this journey of faith and embrace community together. If you have any questions, thoughts, or feedback, we'd love to hear from you. Reach out to us through our social media channels or visit our website to stay connected. Your support is what makes this podcast impactful. If you found today's discussion meaningful, don't forget to subscribe to the podcast, share the episode with a friend, and leave a review. Your engagement helps us spread the message and connect with others who can be encouraged through these conversations. Until next time, we hope this episode inspired you to live out your faith this week. Keep the conversations alive, and remember, we're all on this journey together.